everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the album from Squarepusher presenting Shobaleader 1, The Demonstrator. Alright, this discography review has been stretching on for far too long, and I just want to finish it up and get it all over and done with, so I'm trying to get through this a little more quickly, pick up the pace on these. And now we gotta talk about one of the weirdest and most controversial parts of the Squarepusher story. Well, not necessarily weird out of context and in a vacuum, but if you'd been following Squarepusher up to this point, it was a pretty strange moment, and a lot of people did not know what to make of it. You know how on the last album Jenkinson had some kind of drug trip vision of an imaginary band? With this album, it looked like he was setting out to make that band real, taking the sound he'd explored on tracks from Just A Souvenir like the Coat Hanger and A Real Woman and diving deep into that. Not only that, but actually taking it seriously, too. A mix of acoustic guitars and rough distorted metal guitars alongside his synthetic drum machine percussion and vocoder vocals. And some of his usual bass playing, albeit not at any point really trying to flex his skills at any point. I mean, he had just released an entire album of that the previous year anyways. But the arrangements were much more simple and straightforward than the usual from him, like he was going for some more futuristic take on, like, R&B. It was not remotely like anything he'd ever done before, and some of his fans were really into it, and some were really not into it. Reading through some of these iTunes reviews was kind of fascinating. I had no idea there were people who hated the sound of vocoders, but I guess there's gotta be an audience for everything, or an anti-audience. So I guess we gotta wonder what I personally think of The Demonstrator. I will have to admit, this is definitely one of the lowest ranked Squarepusher albums for me personally, but I still like it, and will still have to put myself on the side of defending this one. So first of all, the people who are complaining that this album is such a far cry from the stuff he was doing previously, I don't put much stock into that. I've always preferred the artists I follow to push themselves and try new things rather than stay stagnant in the same formulas. Even if an experiment goes horribly wrong, I will always give an artist points for trying to experiment at all. And I don't think The Demonstrator is a failed experiment either. For what he's going for, I think it works. Some people have compared it to Daft Punk, and I suppose the LED screen plastered on his face doesn't exactly help that. But aside from some moments on Random Access Memories, which didn't come out until 3 years after this, I don't think it's really that close. This album definitely has its own feel that Daft Punk never really went for. Like in Just A Souvenir, it sounds like it came from some cheap garage band, but one that came from, like, the future or something. The vision and ideas that go into this album are good, and for the most part I find myself really enjoying for what I hear. But, unfortunately, just like with Just A Souvenir, this album's downfall is the production and mixing, which are just really subpar. This album could have really taken you somewhere with the right mixing, could have been like the dark, edgy reboot of Herbie Hancock's Sunlight or something like that. Could have really leaned into the futuristic vibes that it was going for, but again, the production just cheapens the entire experience. You know how I said the distorted guitars from Just A Souvenir were really bad sounding and fuzzed out, pushing out other elements in the mix? Exact same problem here. The fuzzed out guitars here are for the most part sound pretty bad. Now the mixes on The Demonstrator are less dense, there's fewer elements to be pushed out, so the effect might not be quite as bad as it was on the worst moments of Just A Souvenir, but it also leads to the problem that because there's fewer elements going into each track, it brings more attention to those really bad sounding guitars. And sometimes it just feels like it does not fit the kind of vibe that Jenkinson is going for, especially near the end of the album. You got tracks like Abstract Lover and Endless Night, where the guitar does not really feel like it's supposed to be there. In general, the tracks that focus less on the distorted guitars fare better. Heck, the first 4 tracks on this thing are all really good. Plug Me In has a lot more acoustic guitars and lets that take more of a spotlight. It sounds pretty good, and the vocoders get pretty dark and low-pitched in some moments, which I liked too. Synchronize our soul. Baby, that's how we roll. And the distortion is mixed low enough so that it adds texture rather than taking away from it. Into the Blue sounds like it's going for some kind of dreamy disco thing, almost. All the old school synths working up against each other, making a particularly detailed mix. I even heard some funky bass playing in the background at one point. And Frisco Wave is like this sort of romantic, cinematic kind of thing, too. Cinematic in the cheesiest fashion, but still, you know. The softer tracks like these, without the distortion, really provide an insight to what this album could have been if it were mixed better. And for what it's worth, there are heavier tracks on here that can still pull off sounding pretty good. Laser Rock, for instance, has a similarly detailed mix, and the darker and more dramatic vibe still comes across fine, with the distorted and edgier feel coming from a buzzing synth bass rather than the guitars which envelop everything. Magazine is probably the best track to prominently feature the distorted guitars, kinda like the Delta V of this album, where the catchiness and simplicity of the composition makes up for the bad mixing, though the live version on Electrack, which actually mixes it properly, is obviously better. And unlike parts of Cryptic Motion, the funky synth bass works really well here, but you got those kind of 8-beat lead synths which end up having the same effect as the guitars. Mix too loud and drown things out, leading to a less satisfying listen. I'd also really like to enjoy the closer Maximum Plank more, since the idea is cool, and as well as the title. The rough and metal-heavy arrangement is cool, and is a good place to point out how this album would have set itself apart from Daft Punk again, if only the guitars didn't sound so bad as per usual. Yeah, I don't know, maybe I've gotten a little repetitive in this video, but this album doesn't offer as wide a variety of material to discuss as Just A Souvenir did. I know I've really been ragging on the mixing, and I know mixing is not Squarepusher's strength, and never really has been. I even mentioned in Feed Me Weird Things and Hello Everything how they kinda sounded cheap. Even on something like Hard Normal Day, as much as I love that album, the mixing is not something that sticks out about it. It's not good or bad enough to be worth mentioning. But by the same token, he has come out with good mixes before. Just look at Ultra Visitor. You take a track like Steinbolt and look how noisy and rough that is, but it feels like it has so much more space and room to breathe. And he would improve on this front after this album, but we'll get to that in another video. From a pure production and mixing standpoint, this is probably the worst Squarepusher album. I mean, Just A Souvenir may have had moments that dipped down further, but it was more consistently underwhelming here. Even on the tracks I liked more, I'd more praise tracks like Into the Blue and Frisco Wave on the fact that the mix is serviceable and not distractingly bad like other moments on here. None of these tracks have, like, incredible mixing either. Plug Me In is another good example. I mean, I did mention the distortion was low enough to not cut into the track, but the vocoders very much were. It's less of a problem to me since I like hearing them, but it's still worth addressing. In fact, while I'm on the topic of the vocoders, you may notice I've not really mentioned the lyrics on this album either. And that's because I can't understand most of what he says. I know he's speaking English, I still pick up lines here and there, and it's not like I was specifically really trying to listen, since I don't think he went into this album hoping to deliver some kind of deep message anyways. I think the lyrics to Magazine are basically, yeah, 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 yeah. But it is especially notable once again in the later moments on this album when the vocoders get drowned out and what should be English just turns into mush. Now I suppose when you really get down to it, I imagine if this album had been given to someone with more mixing and mastering experience and had done it right, it wouldn't have been as interesting to talk about. Like I said, the idea of this album is good, and this is why I'd still rank this above Do You Know Squarepusher. That album, despite sounding better, I feel is kind of unimaginative and dull by his standards. This definitely has vision and imagination and cool ideas, but they're not quite executed in the most compelling of ways. And that's the thing, I always award a failed experiment over an album that's just an artist doing the same thing they always do. Because at least it's a risk. And again, I wouldn't even say this was a failed experiment, just one that comes up kinda short compared to other stuff he's done in the past. I don't know, for all my gripes, I do still like this album, and out of the 4 or 5 listens I gave it today, like, 3 of them I actually pretty consistently enjoyed them from front to back. Nah, there were some listens, like the last one, where I was just really sick of it, though, too. It's not the kind of album I can put on all the time, but I will still have to recommend this one anyways. It's worth at least one listen for Squarepusher fans looking to see him pushing himself out of his comfort zone, or I guess if you want some decent vocoder-driven R&B stuff. There's plenty to enjoy here to make it worth the trouble, just some pretty clear room for improvement as well. I'm overall feeling a solid 7 out of 10. But of course, it's just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it, that's all for today, see you next time.